All right. Well, today on the show, we are so excited to talk to Bud Simon and Jay Moon. They've just released a brand new book called Effective Intercultural Evangelism. And so we're going to dive into that today. But before we dive in, I'd love for you guys to introduce yourself for our audience and give us a little bit of your story. Bud, would you just start us off here, Bud? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm Bud Simon, and currently I'm just working on my dissertation at Asbury Seminary. My wife and I, we spent 20 years in Brazil doing church planting and in the Amazon jungle. So Lord bless that quite a bit. Us and the people we worked with planted quite a few churches there over the years. So
That's awesome.
yeah,
That's great.
yeah, yeah.
Jay, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, you bet. Great to be with you here, Mark. Thanks for inviting us. My name's Dr. Jay Moon. I'm a professor of evangelism and church planting at Asbury Theological Seminary, as well as the director of the Office of Faith Work Economics. We were missionaries for 13 years, largely in Ghana, West Africa, among a least reached people group, learning about intercultural evangelism and intercultural discipleship, actually being kind of like hit in the face with it. And this book then comes out of both Bud and my experience of over 35 years of dealing with people of different cultures and how to engage them effectively with the good news.
Yeah, and so so many books talk about effective evangelism, but your book is effective intercultural evangelism. And so, could you, Jay, if you could unpack for us what might be the difference between effective intercultural evangelism and just the way that somebody normally would think about evangelism?
Yeah, very good. So, what we're realizing is that the approaches that were formed for evangelism in the 20th century were geared for a particular audience that had a certain worldview. And now in the 21st century, we live in a much more diverse and pluralistic society. So it's more likely you'll engage people who are not from, say, a Christian background or Judeo-Christian heritage, but perhaps they have maybe some background in Islam, or they're Buddhist, or even maybe like indifferent or agnostic, etc. So the formulas that were used, like the four spiritual laws and the Roman road, etc., they weren't bad. It's just that they were tailored for a specific audience. And now in the 21st century, people are using those approaches and realizing that they're not really working. So therefore, we're defining intercultural evangelism as the process of putting Christ at the center of someone's worldview in order to initiate them into Christian discipleship through culturally relevant starting points. And we define, four discernible starting points to help people engage those around them, whether at work or in their neighborhood or wherever, that are relevant and can actually help convey good news instead of something bad or old.
Okay. Yeah. And but so thinking of evangelism that way is that something that followers of Jesus, no matter where they are in their context, we were talking before we hit record, you guys are about 2 hours from where I am. So I'm in Hazard, Kentucky, rural area, and you guys are near Lexington City and that sort of thing. But no matter where people are, is this the way that you think that followers of Jesus should think about evangelism, no matter what our setting is or context, this intercultural, engaging different worldviews?
Right. So that's a great question. And, the subtitle is talking about good news for diverse culture, And so one of the things is that Christ, when he came, he was talking to people where they were. He was trying to meet them where they were. And so he never presented the gospel in the same way twice. And so he was directing his message, he was orienting his message around the audience to draw them to himself and point them towards God. And so really, in the book, we talk about God's at work in everyone's life to try and draw them to himself. And so we see evangelism as, how do we join what God is doing in that person's life? How God is at work in that person's life. A lot of times we've seen evangelism as kind of oppositional or adversarial. And this really moves away from that to really consider, hey, we're really looking and trying to find out how God's at work, what he's doing, and then how we can just join in that. And that's really what worldview is about. We're not trying to challenge like, oh, Christianity is better than Islam, Christianity is better than Judaism. But what are those underlying values that people have, and how does Christianity address those worldview values? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and you've already mentioned two of them that are in the book. Jay, you spoke about guilt a moment ago. You mentioned that, and indifference. Can you just walk us through maybe any way you want to? What are the worldviews that you specifically talk about in the book?
Yes, very good. So as Bud mentioned, that we're trying to catch up on that conversation that God is already having with people, even people that may not think that God is conversing with them, and then continue that conversation towards Jesus. So as you said, the first one, which is like classic, is that the response of sin is that people have internal guilt. And therefore, what Jesus offers is justice. In other words, Jesus becomes that substitute to remove our guilt and have us just standing before God. So that's called like a guilt/justice worldview. There's also what's called, and on the rise, instead of people feeling guilt for their sin, they actually feel shame. And as a result of that, what the gospel offers is not just standing or justice, but really offers honor. In other words, they have honor restored as a child of the king, like the prodigal son experienced. And then the third one is where people don't feel, say, guilt or shame for their sin or wrongdoing, but rather they have fear. And this is what I encountered in West Africa. When the gospel is explained using this type of terminology, that a curse has been upon humanity, and therefore they have fear of the spirit world, of witchcraft, etc. And therefore, Jesus is the power of God for salvation. So that Jesus just doesn't give you justice or honor, but he provides power. So the power of God for salvation. The fourth one that we have been researching and is rather recent is what we're calling indifference. That's where people don't feel per se like guilt, shame, or fear. Rather, they're just indifferent to the gospel. And this often happens like through this process of secularization. And how Jesus responds to that is similar to how he responded to Zacchaeus, where Jesus offers belonging in the community of God with purpose. So there's purpose to their life. So those are the four paradigms of worldviews that we describe in the book, and then give practical steps to how to identify those and to work with people that are inside of those worldviews as their starting point.
Yeah. So you talk about how Jesus would meet people right where they are. This, is another example would say Paul, he goes into Athens and
Right.
just, the way that he's speaking to them, sees all of the, statues and idols to all these unknown gods and that sort of thing. Right. What happens when we try to do evangelism, but we don't bring someone's worldview into mind? Bud, can you speak to that? What might happen?
Yeah, there's a real disconnect, and the good news is not good news. So I experienced this in Brazil, and what would happen is I would just I was well trained. I knew like the four spiritual laws and just the kind of a lot of the classic approaches that were very relevant and made sense here in the United States. Evangelism explosion, some of these different methods. And so when I'd share that or share like those types of sermon illustrations and things, people were very polite, and they were like, "Oh, this is okay news. It's not good news." They were very polite, and no one was like, telling me that was really bad or anything. But one day, what happened was I had a little incident, and this is very typical in American culture, where you go down, you go to a store and they promise a certain service, and then you return the next day and they have not fulfilled that service like they promised. But in a lot of other cultures, and especially in an honor shame culture, they'll just say that so that no one gets embarrassed. They'll say something, but I went in there and I acted in a way that really brought shame on that store owner. And I embarrassed him in front of his employees and some of the other customers and that. Well, I had left there, the Holy Spirit really convicted me. At the time, I did not have a framework for worldviews, but the Holy Spirit was kind of helping me intuit this. And the Holy Spirit said, you need to go back there and apologize to that guy. And just go right in the middle of the day, same time of day, and apologize in front of his employees and his customers, just like you embarrassed him in front of them. So I went and did that, and the result was he says, "Oh, it's no big deal." He went out of his way to serve me, but here was the thing: is when I shared that story as a sermon illustration, this honor shame story as a sermon illustration, everyone at church got up and applauded. So here was a story that struck at the core of their worldview. Hey, this is good news. Someone has come to take away our shame and take it on themselves. So I took that shame, really literally from the store owner, and I said, no, it's all my fault. I'm the one that should be embarrassed here. And they go, wow, that is good news, because it really spoke into their worldview.
Yeah. As I listened to you guys, and I thought of this too as I was reading the book. Jay, tell me if I'm totally wrong here. Just, Mark, you missed the point. But when I hear you two talk about, and like I said, this came across to me in the book. When I hear you talk about worldview, it sounds like you put someone's worldview as part of the underlying conversation that God is already trying to have with that person.
Yes.
So many times, classically, the way that I guess you could say I've been trained to think about worldview is just simply a series of beliefs that people have about the way they see the world. And for me, that was just a new idea that you're saying that this is a part of the way that God is trying to communicate with people.
Yeah,
is that right, Jay?
Yeah, you're right on target, Mark, because this worldview are these culturally structured assumptions upon which people not just form their ideology, but it's also how they form their affections, how they reason through things, how they decide what is good or not. So, it's been said that people often do what they love and not just what they think, right? So the worldview affects your emotions, like why you make certain decisions, like why you think that person is beautiful or is good or not. And why the gospel would be good news is affected by your worldview. So it's not simply just the cognitive ideology going through their head, but it's also these assumptions that they make about everything, basically. It's kind of like wearing sunglasses with a different tint. And different cultures may have like a pink tint or a red tint, but everything they see through it is tinted by that worldview, whether it's a guilt justice or an honor shame or a fear power or indifference belonging with purpose. So therefore, having this understanding of where people are in their worldview gives us a great help forward in knowing where to start the gospel conversation. And as Bud said, our role is we do not have to destroy their faith system of Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or atheism, etc. What we do is we start at the worldview level and engage at the worldview level. And if we do, it's kind of like termites eating the tree roots. And that system of faith will fall over because the gospel will change those worldview roots of that tree in order to move them towards Jesus.
Yeah. So many times when, as a church leader, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this, you talk about evangelism in the church, and a lot of people in church just cringe, or, we're going to do evangelism tonight, and the pastor's the only one who shows up or something like that. And, but a lot of times we just consider evangelism, I've got my sales pitch. Right. Here's the points that I've got to make. One of the things that people have said to me is evangelism feels weird because I'm forcing people to talk about or think about things that they're not thinking about. And you are saying the exact opposite. Right. Bud, you're saying that people, maybe they've never put spiritual language on it, but people are already thinking this way and thinking through these kinds of issues, these questions, this worldview way. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, right. And a lot of times, one of the things that we kind of have the salesman approach is we think we have to close the sale to be successful.
Oh, yeah.
And the book speaks about that too. It says, really, have we helped this person move towards Christ? Have
Mm.
we helped them move towards Christ? Now, that may just mean maybe they've only moved an inch or two. Maybe we've taken that last step with them where they actually pray the prayer and accept Christ. But are we helping them point in the right direction? George Hunter, who's written and done a lot of research and written a number of books on the topic, he says sometimes it takes up to 30 contacts with Christians, 30 conversations before people really become Christians. And so again, this comes back to an era in the 40s, 50s, and 60s where the thought was, hey, we're going to preach the message, we're going to make an invitation, and we're going to say something, this is the day of salvation. You need to make your choice today, and really kind of like try and close the sale. You know, the 21st century it's a different culture, it's a different context, and we have to be aware of that if we want to reach people. If we're trying to use methods from the 50s and 60s,
Mm.
you know, it's ultimately we're going to meet with frustration for ourselves and for these other people too. And so, yeah, so that's just really important that we can kind of tune in to what God is doing in people's lives. So I'll share another story here. One of the things that's really helpful about the book is it has lots of stories
Mm-hmm.
that really help connect the theory with the practice. So the stories are really practical. One of the stories, so for example, this story is in the book. There's a guy, his wife badgered him. His wife was a Christian. She badgered him into coming into church. He did not want to come to church. He was a heavy drinker, alcoholic. He'd get his money on Friday. He'd spend it all over the weekend, and he was pretty embarrassed. He knew he had Christian friends. They don't like people that are drunk all the time. He was broke all the time. He's just embarrassed. So he came to church. He's kind of in the back row, and he's ready. He's not tipping over drunk, but he's had a few. He's had a few. Um, just to get it up the courage to go to church. So they say, in Brazil, you have an expression. They say you need a few to like build up courage. And so he had a few to build up the courage to go to church, and he's sitting in the back row trying to avoid contact, and but he's embarrassed. He knows. My family's broke. We're not paying the bills because I'm drinking too much. My wife's mad at me most of the time. I'm kind of losing the respect of my kids who were already teenagers and adults in his family. And so what happened was our church serves coffee and tea. We kind of have this time of mingling before the service. And he's sitting there. There's a night service. And so he's sitting there in the back row. I went over to him and I put my arm across his shoulder, which is a very common thing in Brazil, you know. And I said, "Hey, I just want to tell you, we're so glad you're here. Man, it's just a real honor to have you here with us tonight." And it just blew the guy's mind. He could
Mm.
not believe that here the pastor of the church was telling him it was an honor to have him there at church. And so then I said to him, I said, "Hey, would you like me to bring you a cup of coffee or some tea?" And that was just like over the top. It was like just for me to offer to serve him, that just doesn't happen, you know, in that culture. And so it was like in his humiliation, it was someone was saying, "Hey, you have worth and you have value." And so literally now that was one of those things where, yeah, at that night, he actually gave his life to the Lord. He tells the story till today, that he was so impressed by all that. And the other things that were going on already had preceded that, but he gave his life to the Lord and is serving the Lord faithfully, 2 decades later. So, yeah, the Lord really uses that and works within people's worldviews.
Yeah. One of the things that stood out to me from the book is the book focuses on evangelism, but just how important this book is for church leaders, no matter where they are and what they're doing, because in the average church, there are going to be represented so many different worldviews.
Right.
And so how can a pastor or a ministry leader discover the worldviews that people in their church may have?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And we talk about double listening.
Mhm.
This double listening is where you're listening really well to the person in order to identify the discernible patterns about which of the four worldviews they're residing in. And we describe that in the book, what to look for. And then the second listening is listening to the Holy Spirit as the
Mhm.
Holy Spirit speaks to you, and as the Holy Spirit is interpreting with you what that person is saying. Now, what we often say, and as you just described earlier, when you talk about evangelism training in the church, people don't often have like warm fuzzies jumping up and down for joy, right?
Yeah.
So we developed a card game called the faith sharing card game that
Mm.
helps people work through these four different worldviews using a storytelling fashion where they're exposed to the four different worldviews in these different narratives that come about. And then they start to gain some competence and some confidence to be able to identify and then address those worldviews with specific biblical approaches. So the card game has been a lot of fun. We've used it with over 500 people. And every time there's a lot of laughter, a lot of joy. I've had lots of folks say, man, this is the most fun evangelism training I've ever had, which I wish I heard that more from more evangelism training. So what I say for pastors is, read the book and then take the card game and try that out with like a Sunday school or a small group or a prayer meeting, etc. And then once you play that, you'll find out this will teach you how to do effective intercultural evangelism, and you can even have fun while doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things, and you mentioned this in the book, but one of the, for anybody that's watching, listening, no matter where they are, and maybe they're thinking, well, this sounds like something somebody should hear. I just don't know I really don't know if this applies to the people that I serve. In the book, you talk about the impact of globalization and the internet. And this might be something that both of you would want to speak to. Bud, we'll start with you. What is the impact of those two things specifically, globalization and the internet? And we can talk about social media and all of that. What's the impact of those two things on say the no matter where the church finds itself, city setting, rural, small town, no matter what it is? What are the impact of those two things, Bud?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I'll start with globalization. What's really happened in the last 50 years is that the chances of running into someone who is very different from you, very different from you, has risen astronomically. And so for example, we'll just start with immigration, for example. About 1 out of every 8 people in the United States is an immigrant. And about 1 out of 3 has an immigrant in their home. So either one of the kids or parents, someone in that immediate family is an immigrant. They were born in a different country. So if you live in a large city, some large cities like Miami, Phoenix, Houston, in the South, they have more than 50% immigrants. Even large cities in the North, like New York and Chicago, the numbers are over 40%. What's that mean? That means someone has come from a place with a completely different worldview. They have other values. They've been born and raised to think about the world differently. In their home, different values are prioritized. So there's not this hard working, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, kind of Puritan work ethic. If you just, work hard, you can get ahead, that type of thing. And so there's this different perspective. And so it's really become important. Globalization has really made encountering people from different worldviews just something that's really common for a lot of people. That just happens in the flow of life. Now, if you're in a rural setting, it's going to be a little more difficult maybe, but even if you go down to your local Walmart, you're going to bump into people that you see from different places. A lot of these places are meeting places and crossroads where people just encounter people, even in smaller cities. Yeah. And so I can, or maybe Jay, you want to talk about the internet a little bit and social media?
Yeah, well, what's happening is this book is not just for those people going overseas or those in like exotic ministries
Right.
among immigrants,
Yeah.
et cetera. What we're finding happening is now, due to social media largely, the young people, particularly say millennials, Gen
Yeah.
Z, they're moving towards a shame honor perspective. So instead of
Mm.
feeling guilty about their sin or wrongdoing, they feel shame, because shame needs an audience, and social media provides a big audience. So
Mm.
therefore, this shame honor perspective is very relevant for folks that are on social media, which is mostly everybody. And then among the addictive community, those who have various addictions, which there's lots of them out there, right?
Mhm.
They're looking for power to overcome their fear of this addiction that's grabbing them. So this fear power worldview is a great place to start with them. But one other area that the internet has affected people is really our learning preference. We've moved from like a print learning preference to an oral learning preference. So I meet people all the time, and here's what they say, Mark. They say, I love to learn. I just don't like to read. Is
Mm.
there any
Yeah.
other way that I can get that information? So it may be a podcast like you're doing here, or it may be an audio book or something like that. So what's happening is people are shifting away from like a print reading kind of preference and towards this oral preference. And now it's mediated through digital means. So Jonas Sachs developed a term called digit oral. So digitoral learners, when people receive massive information through digital means, they exhibit the characteristics of oral learners as opposed to print learners. So therefore, the tracts and the other written approaches to evangelism don't work well with these digit oral learners. So in the book, we talk about the use of narrative, of imagery, and then we recommend some phone apps that have been developed that use pictures, that also use some video, in order to connect with the digit oral learners that are being shaped by the internet.
Yeah. One of the things that, as we're talking about globalization, and just one of the things that comes to my mind is, so many church leaders right now are talking about just the division that's made its way into the church, and
Yeah.
and instead of, it just seems like more and more the division, and we're becoming separated in different tribes, and not even interested in somebody else's worldview. Um, so I guess I have a couple of questions about that. Would you consider that, the maybe a way to put it would be the grip that, say, political ideology might have on us? Would you consider that to be a worldview? And if so, what can church leaders do to even overcome that tribalism, that division of, it's just us, and we're gonna, anybody that disagrees with us, we don't want anything to do with them. What do you think about that? Bud, we can start with you.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's a high octane question there, Mark. But we'll just go ahead and jump right in. I would say this. I would still say, hey, there's a worldview that underlies those those needs that are being expressed through
Yeah.
that politicizing, and that tribalization, of we want to isolate from ourselves from this other group. There's something in them that is looking for that identity, and and you could dig into having to know a little bit more about specifics, but there's a desire for this identity. There's a desire to be valued
Mm.
within a community, and recognized within that. So there's a few things there that I think that when you start addressing those worldview needs, suddenly all that structure that's on top comes tumbling down, or at least it gets loosened up. Suddenly people are willing to give up on that, because their foundations have been addressed. Those, and we call this, in the book. I think we address this as what people's life needs are. What are those things in their life that need to be really addressed?
Mm.
So that may be coming out or may being expressed. They feel powerless, and suddenly they're given power through its expression. They're given a voice over the internet when they express some extreme position, things like this. But it's really hard, because a worldview says this is an underlying motivation. The outward expression may actually come in different ways. And so it takes time and it takes some conversation. There's a story, Jay actually shares that story in the book, but there's a person that was practicing Wicca, and so the idea is, hey, they're actually looking for power, because Wicca is, wrapped up in a lot of spiritual power and so forth. But the deeper they went in conversation, it came out that what they were really looking for was belonging. They were looking for a place to belong. And how can I fit in somewhere? What can I belong? And so that power was really secondary to their desire for belonging. So when the conversation started to resolve, address the desire to belong, they just really softened up, and it started to address that need in their life.
Yeah.
So, yeah, does that make sense?
Oh, that makes total sense. Jay, do you have
Yeah.
anything to add to that? So one is I love what you were saying there, just going underneath and talking about identity and those sorts of things. Jay, do you have anything to add to
Yeah,
that?
I mean, it's a great question because by all means, like the political ideology is an influencer upon the worldview. The danger is when it becomes the dominant influence above their Christian identity. So like James K. Smith has said, you become what you love. And that helps explain things. Like if a Christian has all the right things in their head about who Jesus is and the vocation and calling, but they still love the world, guess how they're going to act? They're going to act like the world, right?
Yeah.
So the challenge is if somebody is still consuming lots of, say, political ideology, and that shapes what they love more than their identity as a member of the family of God, then that's going to, like stilt their worldview, because it's going to shape their love. They're going to act more. They're going to act more like what they love in this ideology politically than they're going to act in their identity with Christ. So what I would say to that for pastors is to help shape people to love Jesus and to love being a part of the family of God. To get there, get underneath of their worldview questions so that they find that they identify that Christ provides either justice for them or power or honor or belonging with purpose. So that would shape what they love, and that starts to change their worldview to move them to Christ, as opposed to being shaped by this political ideology more than their Christian identity. Because you're exactly right, Mark, something as simple as wearing a mask can now all of a sudden be a great divide, whether it's in a classroom or in a church, etc. So let's help people shape what they love, and getting underneath the worldview will help identify that.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the worldviews you talk about in the book that I just find so challenging is the worldview of indifference.
Right.
And so indifference, they just, especially here, I guess you could say the Bible Belt, just familiar with the gospel. I've heard that, and maybe I've even done that. And I just really don't care, but the way you said it earlier, I'd love for you to talk about, belonging before believing. Can you just flesh that out maybe some more? But what do you mean by that? What might that look like to give somebody that's indifferent a place to belong before they necessarily believe?
Yeah, well, this is really powerful. And one of the things that's talked about in the book, and this is an idea that actually comes from Paul Hebert, who is a missiologist started his career in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But he really talked about bounded sets and why am I blanking out on it, Jay?
Centered set.
Help me on. Centered set and bounded sets. Thank you. Just like blinked out there. And so really that's the idea of we like to set up these boundaries, okay? And Christianity often will set up these boundaries of, hey, if you're a Christian, you don't smoke, you don't drink, you don't dance, and you don't chew, there's a lot of don'ts, and those set up these boundaries. And so people can only belong when they meet these certain criteria. But we realize that none of those criteria are really going to get us into or keep us out of heaven. And so Christ, he allowed people to belong before they ever met any of these criteria. So we see him meeting with tax collectors, prostitutes, these people that were really on the outside of society. But his idea was, how can I point these people towards God? They were belonging to his set there. And so in the church, what that means is this: if we have a small group, or if we have some activity, we want to say, hey, you and your family would be welcome. And we'd love for you to come. And there's no pressure on that person to make a decision for Christ. We want them to see that, hey, if they can realize and see and experience with their own eyes, these people value me for who I am, even though they realize I'm going to go home and down a six-pack after this. They know that. I mean, it's no big secret. They realize my wife and I are on the ropes, and maybe we may not even make it through the year, but we're still welcome here. There's more healing in that than trying to say, you need Jesus Christ today, and you need to get your marriage in order so that Jesus loves you. That's just pushing them farther down the hole. Does that make sense?
Oh, total sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I'll add a piece in there. What we find is that people value privacy so much that they lose community. It's kind of like a seesaw.
Yeah.
If you value one, the other goes down. If you value community, you give up privacy. If you value privacy, you give up community. So what's happening, Leonard Sweet has noted, the paradox among millennials is they value privacy so much that has now driven them to hunger community. So what's happening is the starting point for addressing people with the gospel that are indifferent is starting with community. So Zacchaeus is a good example of that. Here's this chief tax collector who is not in the religious system of his day, and he's not totally like with the Roman world, but greatly distrusted even by both. So he's indifferent. So when Jesus comes to his house with his disciples, he doesn't talk about guilt or shame or fear. What he does is he helps Zacchaeus feel like he belongs with the other disciples. And then he's given new purpose for his life and work, where he says, I'll pay back those who have defrauded. And that's when Jesus says, salvation's come to this house. So you're exactly right, Mark. We find this among a lot of students and on university campuses that are really indifferent, but what they're yearning for is community. What they're yearning for is to have some purpose in their life that outstrips them. Even those who we've interviewed that are not a part of the church. One guy put it this way. He said, I'm not a part of a church and I don't have any religious faith yet, but if I did, the thing that I would really most value is be part of that community of the church. So that is a great starting point for sharing what Christ offers people, as opposed to starting somewhere else.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to interject. We often saw a lot of growth through our church and our experience in Brazil with exactly this approach. We had small groups, and we would just say to people, we'd say, yeah, come on to, we're going to have a small group at our house. We're going to, we have some snacks and stuff. And we're going to talk about the Bible. Yeah, we're going to talk about how it helps you have a better family life, how it can help you order your finances, how it can help, with some of these life issues that we're trying to address. And when we had things, we would say, you know what, there's no obligation. You don't have to pray. We're going to pray, but you can bow your head or not bow your head, just whatever you're comfortable with. And they saw that just coming and being part, they were welcome there. They saw it was a welcoming place for them. They didn't have to act weird. There was nothing required of them that would put them in an awkward situation. They were just welcome to partake or not partake in the conversation as they wanted to. We said, and so they could listen and just try to make it very inviting and appealing. And we saw a lot of people come to the Lord through that belonging before believing.
Yeah. Man, this has been so good. I want to honor your all's time today. But I would like to ask you a question. So if you could pull out a crystal ball and kind of peer into the future, are there any worldviews that you see or things kind of bubbling up on the surface that you're kind of noticing that, hey, churches need to be aware of this. Maybe we haven't been able to address it in the book, but this is already happening. We see this. Is there anything like that you say, hey, if the church is not aware of that particular worldview, we're not going to be able to communicate the gospel effectively to these people?
Well, yeah, you're right on track here, because we're not saying that these 4 worldviews are the only ones. We're saying this is an example of what we are finding most common. And we greatly anticipate that as anthropologists and others continue to explore other cultures, we'll find others. So one that has bubbled up to the surface that we did not put into the book, but some have talked about, is the result of sin is pollution, or like getting dirty. And then what Christ offers is this cleansing. So you'll see this often, like say in a Hindu context, where they'll look at sin as being like polluted or being contaminated. And therefore, what Christ can offer them is a cleansing of the soul, etc. Now, Brenda Colligan has a book about images of God, images of salvation in the New Testament, and she describes 12 different images of salvation. And what she says is there's no one image that is used all the time, but there's 12 of these that reside in the Gospels. So hearing that would make us think, Mark, there's likely cultures out there that resonate more towards some of those images than others. And we pulled 4 out that we think are the most common, and the one that's emerging, this indifference. But we expect that this isn't the final chapter on this type of thinking, but this is perhaps like leading some new thinking in this area.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that, for anybody watching or listening, I know there's ministry leaders, in our audience, and just this view, this kind of thinking might be, it was so much of it was new for me, and so many, new for all of us. And so I think this book, when I read this book, I was thinking of evangelism and preaching, and I was everything, it just changes the game for the way that we think to engage people with the gospel. And so, but Jay, this has been great. I would love for people to connect with you guys online, find more of your material. But what's the best way for people to connect with you if they'd like to?
Wow, I don't really have much of an online presence right now, so we're just working hard this year to finish up my dissertation and get some of that stuff finished up. But I'll let Jay go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm easy to reach. w@moons, moons.com. And we often do presentations. We often help churches learn and apply effective evangelism interculturally. And we often go to places like that and introduce the faith sharing card game, which you can get at digitalbiblecollege.com. You can order that card game there that we've developed. And we've also put on presentations for folks that want to learn how to apply this, as well as other areas to address evangelization for the 21st century.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'll link to all that in the show notes. The website you just now mentioned, we'll link to all that. We'll link to where people can get the book. Also want to check out the show notes, because before recording, Bud shared a way to get the book 30% off. And so the website to do that, we'll link to all of that in the show notes. And so, Bud, Jay, this has been such an honor. Thank you guys so much for coming on today.
Hey,
Thank you, Mark. It's been great to be with you.